sometimes some really dangerous things run under the radar of your awareness. And it's only when you look back on the impact that they had on you that you can be so shocked about the damage that they also did. And sometimes those things are wrapped up as so benevolent and good for you that while you're experiencing them, you can even be furious at anybody who might name them in a way that suggests that they are damaging or perhaps less positive than you think they are. And one of those things is actually at the core of almost everything on the internet. Now, there's a book by Edgar Schein, published a few years ago, called Humble Inquiry. And at the heart of that book is the idea that just as I'm rather paradoxically presenting in this broadcast, is that we are advocating far more than we're inquiring. Advocating is telling. Advocating is giving out information. Advocating is offering. Advocating is your status message where you tell people stuff. Inquiring is when we ask. Inquiring is a state of not knowing, is researching, is being open to something, sometimes just waiting for something to come. And the internet and social media is just loaded with constant, relentless advocacy. And it's taken its form, just like on this particular broadcast now. You can hear me sniggering at the irony. It's taking the form of telling. There's a lot of smart thinking. There's a lot of advice. There's a lot of people just opinionating and quite often improvising. And you'll see them talking off the top of their head with whatever comes into their head. And they improvise really well. But it's a stream of consciousness. And when it's not, it's kind of PowerPoint, bullet point advice, stuff, content delivered. If it's food, well, food just keeps arriving on your table, and just as you've even started to digest one dish, more and more dishes are arriving. And that is interesting when you look at the concepts of advocacy and inquiry, because if somebody does give you a piece of life-changing advice, well, you might need to sleep on it. You might need just to be silent with it. It can't really go in properly and even have some sort of impact on your thinking, on your awareness, on your deciding, and your just ability to absorb it. If minutes, seconds later, the next piece of advocacy arrives in the inbox of your life. And that's happening all the time. I've noticed that a lot of the podcasts are fast and furious. They're full of people talking over each other, putting out what appears to be a lot of wisdom. Often it's recycled wisdom too. And sometimes there are gems. But the gems themselves can't have the value that they've actually got because they are just relentlessly part of this stream of content that's being advocated at you. Now, sometimes advocacy also is just a fairly arrogant thing. It's offering you stuff that you don't even need and haven't even asked for. You may be listening, you may have arrived, but that's not a deal that you're then just going to be dumped upon, a kind of waterfall of just constant flow. And of course that's the nature of the medium, and that's the nature of you needing to be on the receiving end of content all the time that can even be related to advocated advertising as well. Now that might be a rather dark view of the internet, but it's what's going on right now, and I think it's a kind of abuse. And it may not be intentional, but we are simply absorbing far more than we can digest, and we end up with a kind of heavy metabolism, particularly down in our will, our ability to actually take action on any of this. And there's been an interesting and fairly scary response in the human race to dealing with all of this content. The noise in the background is a helicopter going over. A little bit more advocacy there for you. And that is simply that we have transferred the whole thing to our head. So I've talked about elsewhere this notion of think-feel, where what we've essentially now got is emotions, but they're just intellectualized. And they can persuade us literally that we feel this stuff, and we can even cry or laugh. But it's a kind of head laughter. So we cope with all this stuff now by having an entire version of our thinking, our feeling and our action actually as an intellectual model in our head. And we respond to stuff and we deal with stuff in the way that maybe you can find on Facebook, where we become a kind of maybe group of people, where we go, that's interesting, I'm interested in that. But it still doesn't actually in the long run lead to us making any changes in our life at all, because what we're receiving, we can only cope with it is we're receiving it in the inbox of our heads. And so you can hear hours and hours and hours of chat online of people that are talking about their feelings and talking about their actions, quite often bigging up things they say they've done that actually in the real light of day they haven't done at all. And there are even stories, say, from the US. I heard one recently of the number of people who actually said they'd read the book Lord of the Rings. Not that you may or may not want to read that book, but they'd read it when they'd actually only seen the film. And that's what we can do. We can actually even hallucinate what we've seen with our eyes and thought with our heads, but it's never made it into the rest of our body in the form of moving our feet. That's how we cope with this deluge of advocacy. But now some inquiry. What if the pace slowed for good reasons? What if silence was a really good place to be? And even just one piece of advice from somebody is something that we need to sleep on and not take the next piece of advice for 24 hours. What if you are so potentially loaded with possibility for your life that what is needed more than ever now is a pacing of this advocacy and this content so that we have time to absorb it? And do you have that ability to allow 2 hours for 10 seconds of powerful, wise thinking? The danger is otherwise it just turns into a list of smart ideas that all make sense, and they light up our heads, but they don't quite move our feet. And after 5 years of billions or millions of words of content and image and like and dislike, we find ourselves in the same place or even 2 steps back. And that's the danger of downloading the podcasts, I believe. What if that extra content isn't actually extra nutrition, but just fat or grizzle? What if all of those ideas and thoughts that actually appear to motivate us only actually stimulate our intellect and put us in a place where what we're actually experiencing is the motivation of our thinking, but not the motivation of our doing? I believe maybe. What if less is more? I invite you to inquire into that. What if silence is sometimes more powerful than just the noise? And what if, even with this broadcast, switching it off, replaying it, parts of it, and just choosing in a much slower space of time what is relevant to you is as important as looking through all the rubbish rocks for that little bit of gold, and that it's not all good just because it's in your hand or because it's heavy. We know far less about how to inquire than how to advocate. The world at the moment is rewarding advocacy, that we are seeking likes if we're podcasters for everything that we put out. We're scared of losing attention, so we're scared of the silence. We overload our broadcasts with more and more content and more stimulation. But what we actually create is a sluggish digestion in our listeners, and then they are just too heavy to even move off the sofa, and they've just got the energy to press the play button once more. Turn this off, put it away, and risk the silence. What if you did that?